women, youth, caregivers, and other vulnerable populations. Secondly, we should establish the Cannabis Legislative Peer Review Committee. This committee would be composed of herbalists, public health experts, social workers, lawyers, educators, police, and community representatives. They'll conduct a one-year evaluation of all cannabis law, including the Cannabis Act 2018 and amendments to the Misuse of Drugs Act 2018. Their responsibility would be to assess the laws of achieving their intended objective, identify implementation gaps, and recommend targeted improvements that strengthen governments while maintaining the original spirit of reform. A successful review process would provide the government with clear, evidence-based recommendations to guide further policy development. This would also allow for targeted initiatives such as public health, healthcare access, public education, economic opportunities, while also ensuring that advancement continues to support both national development and community well-being. This peer review of our cannabis legislation demonstrates our commitment to responsible governance by ensuring that the law is continuously evaluated, improved, and aligned with the needs of our society. Honorable members, as each minister and senator presents to you today, I am positive it will become clear that we share a common mission to achieve effective and forward-thinking cannabis advancement. True prosperity is not achieved through perfection, but through consistency, commitment, and discipline. With structured cannabis reform, we take another step towards a stronger Antigua and Barbuda. Thank you.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Madam Speaker, I rise to make my contribution to the motion. Madam Speaker, on the surface, this motion looks like progress. It's wrapped in shiny paper of social justice and evidence-based approaches. But if we pull back the wrapping, what we actually have here is a classic case of legislative procrastination. Madam Speaker, we are told that we need a joint select committee to understand the impacts of cannabis on our people. But I ask the honorable members, how many times must we study the same struggle before we decide to solve it? The citizens of this nation do not need another 12 months of reporting and consulting. They need immediate legislative fixes and direct financial support now, not a year from today. The proponents of this motion speak as if we're wandering in the dark. They call for evidence-based approaches as if the evidence has not already been delivered. Madam Speaker, I speak today not just as a representative for All Saints East and St. Luke, but with the unique and perhaps inconvenient perspective of a former member of the Committee to Review the Effects of Decriminalization of Marijuana in Antigua and Barbuda. In January 2024, we were mandated by the government to do a review. In July 2025, we submitted a 150-page comprehensive roadmap to the Cabinet of Antigua and Barbuda. That report, which seems to have vanished into a legislative black hole, addressed implementation gaps. It addressed the very human rights and gender concerns this motion claims to be worried about. And yet, here we sit in 2026, and that report is gathering dust. Not one recommendation has been made to date. That is not leadership, that is strategic stalling. It is a fiscal betrayal of the taxpayers who already paid for the answers we are now pretending that we do not have. Why are we asking for a joint select committee to find what has already been found? Unless, Madam Speaker, the goal isn't to find the truth, but to bury it on the new meeting minutes. Madam Speaker, the history of this government's cannabis policy is a chronological timeline of circular governance. In 2014, they focused on over-regulating healthcare professionals instead of laying the groundwork for a robust industry. In 2018, they gave freedom, but they buried local farmers under Section 56, subsection 3 of the international laws they could not afford. Madam Speaker, I would like this House to hear the name Farmer George. George has worked the soil of this country for 40 years. In 2018, he heard the government's progressive talk and invested his life savings to transition to the legal market. He followed the rules, he waited for the prosperity he was promised. But, Madam Speaker, in 2019, instead of helping George, they created a council to study the problem. If that council, which we have been paying for 5 years, could not solve the problem then, why are we creating a new committee now? This isn't governance, it is a recurring nightmare of redundancy. In 2021 came the equity sellout, where the 15% stake of the people was traded for a one-time license fee. They didn't build an industry for Antiguans, they built a members-only club and sold George's membership to the highest bidder. By 2022, they realized their fees were so high that no single citizens could afford to grow cannabis legally. Instead of lowering the cost for George, they told him to huddle together in a group of 5 just to pay the government's ransom. In 2024, after a decade of talk, they've gone back to the dark ages. They've killed the ticket system, they've hiked the fines, they have recriminalized the poor man. Madam Speaker, Farmer George is now a criminal. Again, because he cannot afford the 2024 fines and he cannot meet the 2021 fees. When we price the license at $100,000 US, we aren't blocking just a businessman, Madam Speaker. We are cutting off the breadwinners of our community. 6 legislative attempts in 10 years, 4 amendments under the Misuse of Drugs Act and 2 under the Cannabis Act. And yet, in 2026, this industry is still grasping for air. This isn't governance, it is analysis paralysis. If 6 acts of Parliament couldn't fix the mess, how are we to believe another committee will? Madam Speaker, the math is a disgrace. 6 laws on the books, but only 2 major dispensaries on the ground. 6 laws passed, yet our own people are locked out by license fees. Madam Speaker, if there are known issues with the 2024 Act, fix them via a direct amendment bill today. Why the stalling tactic? Why kick the can down the road while our citizens of this nation face legal uncertainty? The proposals of this motion suggest we need a joint select committee to understand the intersectional needs of our people. Madam Speaker, I do not need a committee to explain intersectionality to me. I only need to look at Sister Mary of my constituency. Mary is a caregiver for her elderly mother. She didn't want a handout. She wanted a small medicinal cannabis business under the 2022 Act to support her family, but she was met with a wall of licensing fees she could not afford. Madam Speaker, the math of this motion simply does not add up. It is a choice between funding institutional overhead and funding direct beneficiaries. The committee offers Sister Mary 12 months of meetings and consultants and academic jargon. The Directorate of Gender Affairs, an agency that already exists, would offer her real-world grants, vocational training, and a social safety net. Furthermore, Madam Speaker, we already pay the Medicinal Cannabis Authority to oversee the industry. We pay the Ministry of Health to make sure the people are safe. We pay the Ministry of Social Transformation to look out for the vulnerable. Why create an institutional overlap? Is this government suggesting that our existing agencies are so incompetent that we need a group of politicians to sit and do their jobs for them?
Honourable Member, you have 1 minute left.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'll quickly wrap up my message. We need to look at the human reality of this motion and not just the pen on the paper, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, as I conclude, I ask the honourable members to look past the ink of this motion. To vote for this motion, you're telling Farmer George to wait another year for the dignity of a legal harvest. You'll tell Sister Mary that her entrepreneurship must stay on hold while you review her struggle. And most cruelly, you are telling someone who has the right to health that they need to wait 12 months for a report. I urge my colleagues to vote against this motion, not because the cause is not worthy, but because the work is already done. Stop studying the struggle and start serving the people by giving them the resources to lead. Stop putting the cart before the horse. If it pleases you, Madam Speaker, I move that this motion be rejected in favor of immediate action. Thank you.
I recognize the member for St. John's City South.
Thank you for recognizing me, Madam Speaker, and a pleasant good morning to my fellow colleagues, members of the opposition, and all those viewing in the gallery and online. Madam Speaker, today I rise in full support of this resolution to establish a joint select committee to review the cannabis legislative framework in Antigua and Barbuda. And Madam Speaker, as I stand in this very chamber, I am reminded that I once stood here under the National Youth Parliament debating a resolution of similar importance. That in itself speaks to the gravity of this matter. Cannabis legislation has never been a light or passing issue. It carries real implications for law, public safety, health, and the wider society. Madam Speaker, cannabis legislation in Antigua and Barbuda has not been a one-time discussion. It has evolved through amendments in 2014, 2018, 2019, 2022, and 2024. That tells us that this is not a settled issue. It is an evolving one. And Parliament has a duty to ensure that the law evolves wisely with it. In 2018, Antigua and Barbuda decriminalized possession of up to 15 grams of cannabis for personal use. More recently, the 2024 amendment changed penalties and parts of the legal structure again. That is why review is necessary. When laws keep changing, Parliament must ask not only what was passed, but what is actually working. Madam Speaker, as Attorney General with responsibility for legal affairs, I say clearly, passing a law is not the end of Parliament's job. It is the beginning of Parliament's responsibility. Good law must not only sound good on paper, but it must work in practice. If legislation creates uncertainty or unintended consequences, then responsible governance demands review. This resolution gives Parliament the opportunity to examine whether the current framework is clear, enforceable, fair, and aligned with the wider public interest. Madam Speaker, from the standpoint of public safety, this review is essential. If the law is unclear, the consequences do not remain theoretical. They show up in police work, in prosecutions, in courts, and in the public's understanding of what is permitted and what is prohibited. A joint select committee will help to determine whether the current framework provides clear guidance to law enforcement and closes the gap that may have emerged over time. Madam Speaker, this is also a matter of immigration and border control. Antigua and Barbuda may be a small state, but we are highly connected. We are a tourism destination, a port state, and a regional gateway. That means our cannabis laws cannot be reviewed in isolation. They must be considered in the wider context of border security, customs enforcement, international obligations, and transnational crime prevention. Madam Speaker, my portfolio also includes labor, and that matters here as well. Any change in legal framework raises practical questions for the workplace, particularly around safety, employee guidance, and employee rights. Madam Speaker, one of the strongest features of this resolution is that it does not call for guesswork. It calls for consultation, evidence, and analysis. It asks this committee to hear from public health experts, legal professionals, law enforcement, civil society, youth groups, community organizations, and the wider public. It also calls for a gender and intersectional lens, recognizing that laws do not affect all people equally. This resolution is not about reopening the issue recklessly. It is about reviewing the issue responsibly. Madam Speaker, it tells the people of Antigua and Barbuda that Parliament is prepared not only to pass laws, but to examine the results, identify weaknesses, consult the public, and improve what needs improving. Madam Speaker, this resolution strengthens Parliament's ability to ensure that the cannabis framework of Antigua and Barbuda is effective, equitable, and fit for purpose. For those reasons, Madam Speaker, I give this resolution my full support, if it pleases you.
I recognize the honourable member for Barbuda.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Good morning, everyone. Madam Speaker, while I commend the motion brought forward by my colleagues on the other side, I make the case as MP for Barbuda that a joint select committee is not necessary now, but instead those resources should be directed to Barbuda's farmers, youth, education, and health priorities. Our national framework is not standing still. It is already evolving in practice. During the MCA's stakeholder meeting, the Attorney General stated plainly that he is committed to ensuring that the economic benefits of this industry reach the ordinary citizens of Antigua and Barbuda. He reminded us to make certain that our share of the pie is big. Madam Speaker, this is why I propose direct investment where Barbuda needs it most. Investment into the people, the training, and the market pathways that will allow Barbudans to claim their rightful share. The Cannabis Amendment Acts of 2021 and 2022 have already strengthened regulatory roles and licensing to the MCA, also known as the Medicinal Cannabis Authority. The framework exists. What Barbuda needs now is the support to access it. Let me be clear, Barbuda does not ask for special treatment. We ask for smart allocation. Our people have the land and the skills. The state has already built a functioning regulatory role. Now, we need boots on the ground training, cooperative finance, justice implementation, and health services that convert policy into Barbudan livelihood. As we pursue this, we will uphold the law. Decriminalization is limited, and commercial activity must be licensed with protections for public spaces. This balanced approach keeps our youth safe while enabling Barbudans to lead in a medicinal regulated market. Madam Speaker, medicinal access is not yet equitable by geography. The government could host special medical outreach clinics in Barbuda, bringing doctors, pharmacists, and cannabis specialists to explain the benefits and risks face to face. We must reduce geographic access barriers through mobile dispensing days, telehealth renewal clinics, and secure click and collect services, all under the MCA's supervision. Madam Speaker, these are operational fixes, not legislative actions. The commitment of state resources should instead support urgent national priorities such as public health education on substance use and substance use prevention. Moreover, school-based education has launched, but Barbuda has yet to see it. In February 2026, the MCA launched a school-based cannabis education program across 9 schools, with the intentions of creating PTA partnerships with home-based awareness to reduce risky behaviors like smoking around children. No published report confirms a Barbudan school among the first 9. These gaps can be closed this term. They do not require a select committee. What we need now is Barbuda inclusive school visits, PTA partnerships, as well as prevention programs for boys and girls. Madam Speaker, there is a need for the implementation of gender-responsive and intersectional policies, health worker outreach program, and culturally tailored messages around the island. All of this falls within the existing powers of the MCA, the ONDCP, and national health bodies. A joint select committee may have its place, Madam Speaker, but committee reviews alone do not educate a single child. They do not protect affect a single pregnant woman, and they do not reach a single vulnerable household. Barbados does not need another committee to tell us what we already know. The MCA is functioning, laws are being updated where necessary, justice reform is in train, and our health commitments are clear. Let us implement these operational fixes now, measure results transparently, and only then consider whether a joint select committee adds value. Until then, I respectfully urge the honourable members to reject the motion and direct our agencies to act immediately on the measures outlined for the nation we all serve. Thank you.
I recognize the member for St. Philip South.
Good morning, everyone. Madam Speaker, good governance is not just about reviewing laws. It is about reviewing them at the right time. Honourable members, let me state clearly from the outset, the opposition is not afraid of review. We are not afraid of accountability, but we must ask ourselves a simple and reasonable question. Is now the right time to establish a joint select committee? From our perspective, it is not. Firstly, implementation is still ongoing. The Cannabis Act 2018 introduced major national reform, medical regulation, religious protection, licensing system, and the creation of the Medical Cannabis Authority. Soon after, Parliament strengthened it through the Cannabis Amendment Act 2021, tightening standards and improving oversight. These reforms are still being implemented. Legislation of this scale does not produce measurable results in just a few years. Policy needs time. Time to see whether crime trends shift, whether youth usage changes, whether promised revenue materializes, and whether public health outcomes improve. Without that time, we are not evaluating impact, we are evaluating expectation. Secondly, a review without evidence is premature. The motion calls for a broad national review, social, economic, legal, and health impacts, but meaningful review requires long-term data. At this stage, we do not yet have enough national evidence to determine whether decriminalization has reduced criminal records, whether youth exposure has increased or declined, whether economic opportunity is reaching ordinary citizens, or whether public health indicators has changed significantly. So what exactly would this committee be reviewing today? Not measurable outcomes, not long-term trends, not confirmed impact. It would be reviewing assumption, and policymaking based on assumptions is not strong governance. It is speculation. Thirdly, responsible use of national resources. Honourable members, establishing a joint select committee is not cost-free. It involves staffing, research, consultations, reports, and operational expense, funded by taxpayers. At this time, when families are facing higher costs of living, when young people in communities like St. Philip South are seeking employment, when social programs require strengthening, we must ask, is this the best use of limited national funds right now? Because those same resources could support youth development initiatives, drug prevention education, healthcare services, and community empowerment programs. If our concern is truly public well-being, investment must reach people, not paperwork. Fourthly, the impact on St. Philip South. Madam Speaker, in St. Philip South, we are not discussing theory. We are discussing youth unemployment, limited small business access, economic instability. If cannabis reform was meant to stimulate opportunity, then we must ask,
How many young people in my constituency have received training? How many small operators have successfully entered the market? How many caregivers understand the medical access process? Because the legislation that does not translate into community empowerment is unfinished work. Madam Speaker, this debate is not about cannabis alone. It is about timing. It is about responsibility. It is about disciplined governance. Good laws deserve fair time before fair judgment. And in this honorable House, we must ensure that evidence leads policy, not politics. I thank you.
I recognize the member for All Saints West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Good morning, everyone. Madam Speaker, I rise as Minister of Agriculture to oppose the motion calling for the establishment of a joint select committee to review cannabis legislation. Let me start by saying, review is important, accountability is important, and no one in this House is afraid of scrutiny. But good governance is not only about asking questions. It is also about knowing when those questions make sense. And right now, Madam Speaker, the timing of this proposed review is premature. Our Honorable Prime Minister stated it was a peer review committee. Already we have confusion. Is it a joint select committee or is it a peer review committee? The cannabis industry in Antigua and Barbuda is still developing. Legislation passed in 2020 legalized medical cannabis and hemp cultivation, and regulatory bodies were set up immediately, including licensing and compliance systems. Monetary mechanisms already exist. This framework was not thrown together overnight. Safeguards and oversight were built directly into it from day one. So when I hear calls for a joint select committee already, I have to ask a very simple question. What exactly is failing? Because if we're going to suggest that the entire framework requires a parliamentary review, if we're going to suggest that the entire framework requires parliamentary review, surely there must be evidence. Surely there must be data showing regulatory collapse or systematic breakdown, but none has been presented. In public policy, we must be careful not to create solutions in search of a problem. Agriculture depends on stability, and as such, farmers plan seasons ahead. They invest land, labor, and resources long before they see results. Small producers entering the cannabis sector do the same, often with limited resources, but a lot of hope. What they need from us is confidence in the rules and clarity about licensing and compliance. When legislation is reopened too quickly, it sends a message that the foundation may not be stable, and that message discourages participation. Yes, every new industry faces challenges. Cannabis cultivation is highly regulated for safety, quality, and export standards. Adjustments will always be necessary, but these do not automatically require another committee. Stronger enforcement, clearer communication, and better guidance are often enough. At this stage, the focus must be growth, supporting farmers, ensuring compliance, educating participants, and allowing the sector to develop responsibly. Madam Speaker, being new does not mean being broken. It simply means that the Antigua and Barbuda Cannabis Authority, established in 2020, already provides insight and oversight. Ministers can be questioned, reports can be requested, agencies can be examined, and Parliament has the tools for accountability. Reassurance to the public does not come from forming an additional committee. It comes from visible results. Fair licensing, responsible enforcement, and a sector stable enough for people to participate with confidence. As Minister of Agriculture, my responsibility is to protect stability and growth. My duty is to ensure that farmers are supported and that this industry develops in an orderly and responsible way. The motion may be well-intentioned, but it is unnecessary at this time. Let us strengthen what we have, improve implementation, and support our farmers with clarity and confidence. Let us give this industry the stability it needs to grow. For those reasons, Madam Speaker, I firmly oppose the motion. Thank you.
I recognize the honourable member for St. Paul.
Madam Speaker, responsible governance does not end when legislation is passed. It continues when Parliament has the courage to examine how that legislation operates in the lives of the people we serve. I therefore rise in full support of this motion to establish a joint select committee to review cannabis legislation in Antigua and Barbuda with a human rights and gender-responsive approach. I would like to state that Parliament should not just be seen as a body that passes laws, but also one that embraces post-legislative scrutiny. I believe that this, Madam Speaker, is a hallmark of a true democracy. Referring to the acts in question, this Honourable House has time and time again amended them where fit, accounting for significant reform. However, it is time now that we introspect to see with prudence the efficacy of these acts within our country. In other words, have they truly worked for us, or have we in some instances dropped the proverbial ball? As Minister of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Barbuda Affairs, I view this motion through the lens of our international obligations. Antigua and Barbuda has signed on to multiple human rights treaties, to include the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We therefore have fiduciary responsibility to ensure that we act within a lawful and ethical manner to uphold our commitments. From a trade perspective, regulatory oversight and clarity matters. Countries are constantly looking to invest in economies that demonstrate oversight, data-informed policy, and legitimacy. Through a joint select committee, we can explore compliance with global obligations and domestic priorities. Now, Madam Speaker, through the decriminalized structure, we cannot market cannabis for commercial gain. However, medicinal cannabis can be incorporated through medical tourism, where with proper regulatory oversight, we stand to boost our tourism sector. I know my fellow Minister of Tourism would appreciate that. Honourable members, it is a fact that Barbuda is on its way to becoming an economic powerhouse. As the Minister for Barbuda Affairs, I hope that consideration can be given and research done to see how our sister island may benefit directly from this. Madam Speaker, in my constituency, there's an outcry to the ease of access of cannabis to our teens. Focus has shifted from the idea of decriminalization to legalization, far from the intention of these acts and amendments we're discussing today. In fact, our Director of Child and Social Services has spoken numerous times regarding the grave effects that drugs like cannabis is having on our school-age youth. This issue therefore warrants the work of the Joint Select Committee to ensure that we as a nation are in compliance with Article 33 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Further to this, the committee can also identify areas of misalignment between the Misuse of Drugs Act, the Cannabis Act, and their subsequent amendments. For example, the Misuse of Drugs Act of 2018, Section 6C, speaks directly to children found in possession of cannabis. However, Madam Speaker, this is in no way reflected in the Cannabis Act of 2018. Alignment in policy is integral to ensuring legitimacy, enhancing stability, and enforceability. Finally, I firmly believe that reform without education is incomplete reform. How well are our citizens educated about decriminalization versus legalization? How much have we truly invested in programs that boost education through media outlets and community consultations? How often have we gone back since the passing of these acts to see the extent to which our communities are affected for the better or for worse. The motion before us therefore warrants careful consideration. It also calls us to accept the reality that policy should never operate in isolation. Data and research therefore must guide us. Where there are gaps, we must close them. We must demonstrate to our citizens, the people that we serve, especially our youth and working families, that Parliament listens, that Parliament evaluates, and Parliament evolves. Honourable members, I therefore reaffirm my support in this motion so that our legislative framework may be more effective, equitable, and considerate to our international obligations. Thank you.
Before we go any further, Madam Clerk, you didn't bow when you came back in. No, you gotta go. You gotta go right there. Perfect. I recognize the honorable member for St. John's City East.
Madam Speaker, the cannabis policy is not only a legal matter. It affects land use, community development, housing stability, and economic activity within our communities. When legislation shapes industries, livelihood, and neighborhood well-being, ministries responsible for national development must also ensure that these systems function fairly and responsibly. Therefore, as Minister of Housing, Lands and Urban Renewal, I strongly support the establishment of the Joint Select Committee. Madam Speaker, we as members of government understand what a Joint Select Committee is, though I wish I could say the same about the opposition. It is our understanding that such a committee is necessary because good governance requires consultation. Laws that affect society so broadly should reflect the voices of citizens, professionals, and communities, not simply the opinions of a few. Madam Speaker, the Constitution also guides us here. The preamble reminds us that governance must engage social justice, economic well-being, and fairness for all citizens. Section 3 guarantees that fundamental rights and freedom of all persons, including equality before the law. And Section 10 recognizes that laws must regulate certain activities when necessary in the interest of public health, public order, and public safety. If our Constitution calls for fairness, equality, and responsible governance, I cannot understand why some may be led to believe that this structured review of this legislation is unnecessary. Speaking of responsible governance, Madam Speaker, this government has already recognized the need to adapt with the times. Between 2014 and 2024, the Misuse of Drugs Act shifted from strict prohibition to decriminalization, sacramental recognition, and tighter policy use regulation. The Cannabis Act of 2018 legalized cannabis for medicinal purposes, while the 2021 amendment expanded licensing, established the Medicinal Cannabis Authority, and formalized industrial and creative uses. Yet, responsible governments do not simply pass laws and walk away. Madam Speaker, cannabis reform carries real economic and social consequences. A regulated sector must benefit small farmers, licensed cultivators, and distributors, while creating jobs in processing, testing, retail, and agri-tech. Yet vulnerable groups face barriers. Low-income farmers may struggle with fees and land titles, youth risk exposure to misinformation, and caregivers or small producers may be excluded from opportunities. Madam Speaker, this committee will therefore identify implementation gaps, inconsistencies, and unintended consequences within the framework. It will review public health programs, education initiatives, and training opportunities while also assessing whether sufficient resources existed to ensure fair and effective implementation. It will ensure that the experiences of women, youth, and vulnerable communities are considered in evaluating policies' outcome. Madam Speaker, one must ask, if the framework is functioning properly and perfectly, why would any member oppose a transparent review? Surely a responsible parliament has nothing to fear from evidence, or perhaps some simply prefer not to ask difficult questions about who benefits and who does not. Madam Speaker, in closing, establishing a joint select committee is not a political theater. It is responsible governance. A mature democracy reviews its policies. A confident parliament welcomes scrutiny, and a responsible government ensures that reform is guided by accountability, fairness, and evidence. I therefore urge honourable members to support this motion and allow the committee to perform a careful and inclusive review that the people of Antigua and Barbuda deserve. Thank you.
I recognize the member for St. George.
Pleasant good morning, Honourable House, Madam Speaker. This motion does not seek to undo reform, it seeks to understand it. Over the past few years, Antigua and Barbuda has reshaped the cannabis laws through multiple amendments. That took courage, it took a vision, but legislative courage must be matched by legislative accountability. For many years, questions have raised about the human impacts of cannabis laws, particularly on young people, small communities, and individuals whose lives have been permanently affected by minor convictions. We must also recognize the cultural and religious dimensions associated with the sacramental use of cannabis within the communities connected to Rastafari movement. These matters cannot be ignored if we are serious about fairness and equality before the law. However, Madam Speaker, while we support their principle of review, our support must not be mistaken for blind acceptance of the process. The opposition has the duty to ensure that this committee is not simply a political exercise or a mechanism to delay meaningful action. A joint select committee is not an attack on the law. It is a parliament doing its job. Post-legislative scrutiny is a mature democracy's way of ensuring that the reform not only works in theory, but in practice. The questions before us this morning are simple. Are the outcomes matching the intentions? Have arrests decreased equitably across communities? Are small producers accessing opportunity or only those with capital? Is medicinal cannabis affordable for all families who need it? Are youth and women participating meaningfully in the industry or watching from the margins? Does the government collect disaggregated data by gender, age, and income? Has the Parliament reviewed a formal implementation report since the last amendment? What measurable indicators define success under the current framework? Are women proportionately represented among license holders? Has caregiving responsibility limited women's participation in the cannabis industry? Are enforcement practices impacting young men and women differently? Are enforcement practices impacting young men and women differently? Is medicinal cannabis affordable to ordinary citizens? Are caregivers and family adequately supported? Are rural populations accessing the program at the same rate as urban communities? These are not ideological questions. These are governance questions. Madam Speaker, the opposition will approach this matter constructively. We are prepared to participate in this committee and contribute meaningfully to its works. But we will also hold the government accountable to ensure that the process remains credible, transparent, and focused on real outcomes. If the framework is working perfectly, then this review will affirm it and strengthen the public confidence. If there are gaps in enforcement access, equity, or resource allocation, then we have a responsibility to address them. We cannot pass laws and then look away. We cannot speak of economic opportunities without knowing who benefits. We cannot speak of decriminalization without examining whether its promise has been realized equally. And we cannot speak of human rights without ensuring that our policies reflect the lived experiences of our people, women, youth, caregivers, rural communities, and those who are historically marginalized. Our position is simple. If this committee is established in good faith, and if it genuinely seeks to balance human rights, public health, and social justice, then it can serve as an important purpose for our nation. But if it becomes an excuse in delay or political theater, our opposition will not hesitate to say so. This motion is not about cannabis alone. This is about whether the Parliament is willing to examine the consequences of its own decisions. Laws are not monuments carved of stones. They are living instruments, and living instruments must be reviewed, refined, and strengthened over time. If we were bold enough to reform, we would be mature enough to review. Let us choose evidence over assumptions, equity over complacency, oversight over silence. Madam Speaker, Honorable House, I thank you.
I now recognize the honorable member for St. Philip's North.
Madam Speaker, reform without review is not progress, it is negligence. I stand today as member for St. Philip's North and as your Deputy Speaker. Over the last decade, this Parliament passed the Misuse of Drugs Amended Act of 2014, 2018, 2019, and 2024, and the Cannabis Amended Act 2022. We decriminalized the possession of up to 15 grams. We allowed 4 plants per household. We became the first Caribbean country to officially grant Rastafari sacramental use. We built a medicinal and licensing framework. That's historic, right? Yes. But is it finished? Absolutely not. Because personal law does not guarantee justice. And if we are serious in this house, we must be able to ask uncomfortable questions. Has decriminalization truly reduced the long-term impact of minor offenses on our young men? Have we ensured that expungement is accessible, not just announced? Are small farmers actually able to enter this industry, or are licensing costs quietly shutting them out? Madam Speaker, we have already seen contradiction in the law. A cultivator fined thousands because transport rules conflicted with cultivation rights. That alone proves implementation gaps exist. If we refuse to review the framework, we are choosing to ignore warning signs. My constituency, St. Philip's North, it is rural. We have land. We have agricultural experiences. We have young people who understand cultivation from childhood. If any constituency should benefit from a fair cannabis industry, it is St. Philip's North. But opportunity is not real if it's not accessible. Licensings require capital. Compliance requires infrastructure. Training must reach beyond St. John's. If this industry grows, but rural districts are priced out, then we have created economic reform on paper and exclusion in practice, and this is unacceptable. This motion does one simple but powerful thing. It demands accountability. It establishes a joint select committee to examine real impacts, social, legal, and public health. It doesn't create room for speculations, nor does it create room for assumptions. It provides us with evidence. It requires consultations with public health experts, gender specialists, law enforcement, youth groups, farmers, women organizations, and the community. Why? Because as my fellow member for St. John City South rightfully said, laws does not affect everyone equally. Women may face different barriers to licensings. Youths may face different risks of misuse. Low-income households may experience different enforcement patterns. Rural communities may experience different levels of access. If we refuse to apply a gender and interceptual lens, we are deliberately choosing not to see inequality. And let me be very clear. If the system is working perfectly, this review will most definitely prove it. But if there are gaps, then we fix them. So today I ask, members of the opposition, what exactly are you afraid of finding? If we have nothing to hide, then if we have nothing to hide, then why must we fear a review? If reform is strong, evidence strengthens it. If reform is flawed, evidence corrects it. Either way, transparency wins. Madam Speaker, Parliament has a constitutional duty not only to legislate, but to evaluate. Post-legislative scrutiny is not optional in a functioning democracy. It is a responsibility. It is our responsibility. This committee will report back within 1 year. This is not delay. This is discipline. And for my people in St. Philip's North, this review means examining whether small farmers can realistically access licensing, ensuring training reaches rural constituencies, reviewing whether economic benefits are equitably distributed, accessing whether budget allocation supports education and public health safeguards. Because fairness is not a slogan, it is measurable. We cannot celebrate industry growth while ignoring who is excluded from it. We cannot claim justice while failing to monitor enforcement patterns. We cannot speak of opportunities while rural constituencies remain observers instead of participants. Madam Speaker, leadership is not stubbornness. Leadership is courage. Courage to review what we have built. So today, Madam Speaker, I choose courage. Hence, I support this motion, not because it sounds good, but because it is necessary, if it pleases you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize the Speaker for St. John's Row North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I too rise in support of the motion before this Honorable House to establish a joint select committee to review Antigua and Barbuda's cannabis legislative framework. But first, let me ask a question, and I know the opposition feels the need to oppose for the sake of opposing, but here's my question. Is reviewing the legislation a bad thing? Of course not. In fact, responsible governments review laws all the time, because in reality, societies evolve, industries evolve, and as well, policies must evolve. Madam Speaker, Antigua and Barbuda has already taken responsible steps in recent years to regulate a medicinal cannabis framework. And those reforms, they definitely did lay an important foundation. But the real question today is that framework still in the best way possible for the people of Antigua and Barbuda? And if there are improvements to be made, should we not examine them? That is exactly what this joint committee allows us to do. Madam Speaker, there's another important question. What opportunities could exist within a properly regulated system? Across the world, we see regulated medicinal cannabis industries creating opportunities for innovation, entrepreneurship, medical research, and local product development. Cannabis is not simply a plant. In many countries, it's refined into medicinal oils, tablets, and administered under controlled medical treatments. Of course, that's administered under strict regulatory systems. But let's bring this discussion closer to home. Madam Speaker, Antiguans and Barbudans are familiarized with herbal teas. We drink our soursop tea, we drink fever grass tea, we drink our lemongrass tea, you know, our bush tea. These are traditions that have been passed down through generations. Actually, I received this simple pack of tea earlier today, right? And I know you're wondering, the next question is, Honorable Minister, what does this represent? This represents local entrepreneurship. This was made by Shade Hydroponics right here in Antigua, right? And this also represents value-added products created by our own people. It represents the ability of Antiguans and Barbudans to take something in its natural state, refine it, process it, package it, market it, and sell it successfully. And Madam Speaker, what I'm saying here is, in a carefully regulated system, similar opportunities could exist within this industry as well. But economic opportunity must, of course, be always balanced with responsibility. And that brings us to another important issue. As Minister of Tourism, Civil Aviation, Transportation and Investment, I must discuss our national reputation. Right now, Antigua and Barbuda is known to be a country that's well-governed, stable, safe for investors, and of course, respected internationally. Our tourism industry depends on it. Our aviation sector, it depends on it. Our investment climate, it also depends on it. So the question now becomes, how do we ensure that any development within this sector protects that same reputation? The answer is simple. Strong regulation, strong oversight, and responsible governance. And that is precisely what reviewing the legislation allows us to strengthen. Madam Speaker, the Joint Select Committee also creates something very important: consultation. Because good laws, as my colleague said, good laws are not done or made in isolation. Through this committee, we can expect to hear from medical professionals, legal experts, law enforcement, possibly the Chamber of Commerce, faith-based organizations, entrepreneurs, and of course, the wider public. In other words, the people that we serve. Madam Speaker, I need the opposition to understand that reviewing legislation after implementation, it's nothing unusual. In fact, it's a hallmark of good governance, because laws should not remain frozen in time. They must evolve as we learn more about their social impact, economic impact, and of course, their public health implications. Our duty is to ensure, our duty as legislators, as my colleagues said, and I will reiterate, our duty as legislators is not to simply pass laws, but our duty is to ensure those laws continue to serve the best interests of the people of Antigua and Barbuda. Let's not forget, the same people of Antigua and Barbuda who elected us to serve. Economic development must always be strategic, inclusive, and sustainable. And by establishing this Joint Select Committee, Madam Speaker, this Parliament demonstrates its commitment to doing just that. Madam Speaker, I support this motion wholeheartedly, if it pleases you.
I recognize the member for St. John's Rural West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, honorable members, last week I spoke with a young woman in St. John's Rural West. She's a single mother, she's ambitious, and she's determined. She told me she had been studying the regulatory framework for entry into the cannabis industry. She attended consultations, saved her earnings, and was considering whether she could build a small business to support her family. Her first question to me was not about ideology nor politics. It was quite simple. She asked me if the law was stable. Can I plan around it? Madam Speaker, that question about stability and certainty is why I rise today in opposition to the motion entitled Establishing a Joint Select Committee to Review Cannabis Legislation in Antigua and Barbuda. I speak particularly mindful of the interests of the people of St. John's Rural West, where the priorities are economic opportunity, community security, and predictable governance. Let me be clear. I support the protection of human rights and gender equity advancement. However, responsible governance also demands stability, fiscal prudence, and respect for institutional processes. This motion, though well-intended, is unnecessary and premature at this time. Firstly, Madam Speaker, the risk of regulatory instability and investor uncertainty. Small economies depend on certainty. The cannabis sector requires licensing clarity, consistent compliance standards, and stable taxation frameworks. The cannabis sector, for frequent reviews to occur, it creates a volatile framework subject to change on a yearly basis. In Jamaica in particular, early cannabis reform saw slow industry growth as stakeholders cited regulatory complexity and uncertainty as barriers to entry. The International Monetary Fund has repeatedly emphasized that investor confidence in small states is highly sensitive to regulatory stability. If Parliament signals that the entire cannabis framework will be reviewed within a year, what message are we sending to entrepreneurs seeking financing, to small farmers seeking entry, and even the credit unions assessing risk? For that young mother in St. John's Rural West, predictability determines whether she risks her life savings. For traditional cultivators, including members of the Rastafarian community, stricter licensing requirements could limit access to legal cultivation, increase compliance costs, and exclude traditional practitioners from participation. Secondly, Madam Speaker, this review risks delaying justice. Prolonged legislative review processes often delay record-clearing mechanisms for individuals with minor cannabis convictions. For many men in St. John's Rural West, this means continued barriers to employment, continued difficulty accessing financial services, and delayed restoration of civil rights. Madam Speaker, the consequences extend beyond the individuals. They affect families. When men are excluded from the formal labor market, many women are forced to become the sole economic provider for their households. Mothers, daughters, and partners carry the financial burden, while families struggle with reduced opportunities and the social stigma. Families who have already endured years of hardship should not have to wait even longer for economic inclusion. Thirdly, Madam Speaker, the risk of politicizing a cultural and religious issue. Cannabis reform has long been of divided opinion. We must remember that for many Rastafarians, cannabis is not merely a commodity, but a sacred element of religious practice. The Caribbean Community Regional Commission on Marijuana has documented that Rastafarians experience systematic discrimination and disproportionate enforcement on the prevention policies. Madam Speaker, do we risk reopening debates about religious rights that communities have struggled for decades to secure? And I must ask, do the honourable members of this House accept that establishing a lengthy review process could delay reforms such as record expungement and economic inclusion for many Rastafarian men and young men of the St. John's Rural West, who have historically been criminalized for small amounts of cannabis? To conclude, Madam Speaker, for the sake of fiscal prudence, economic confidence, and stability in Antigua and Barbuda, I respectfully oppose the motion. The young woman I spoke with deserves clarity, not uncertainty. Madam Speaker, our duty is not to create more processes, but to create real progress for the people we represent. The families of St. John's Rural West need opportunity, stability, and clarity, not another committee. For their sake, I cannot support this motion. I thank you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize the honourable member for St. Mary's North.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Good morning. I'd just like to acknowledge that today marks a historic event as we witness an all-women's debate in Antigua and Barbuda. Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the establishment of a joint select committee to review our cannabis legislation and its impact on our society. The youth of this nation are the future of Antigua and Barbuda, and every law that we pass in this honourable House must ultimately be measured by one fundamental question: does it protect the future of our young people? Madam Speaker, when policy begins to produce outcomes that may place our young people at risk rather than protect them, responsible leadership demands that we pause, reflect, and evaluate. There was a time in this country when many young people were incarcerated simply for the possession of cannabis. Young men and women would serve time for minor possession, and when they returned to society, they carried a criminal record that followed them for life. Yet incarceration itself did not solve the problem. Young people would serve their time, return to their communities, and the same cycle would repeat itself. It was in that context that this Parliament moved toward reform and decriminalized the use of marijuana. But let us be clear, decriminalization was never intended to be endorsement. It was intended to be compassion. It was meant to prevent young people from carrying a permanent criminal record for behavior that incarceration itself had failed to correct. However, Madam Speaker, over time, we have begun to observe new realities within our society. Some individuals now interpret decriminalization as acceptance. Behavior among some young people has shifted, and that requires careful reflection, because a young person is a product of his or her environment. Legislation may set the boundaries of behavior, but society shapes the choices within those boundaries. The law does not live inside the home, it does not sit inside the classroom, and it does not guide a young person throughout the daily pressures that they face. which is why we must examine this issue holistically. There was a time in Antigua back then where every primary school student was taught a subject called civics. Students were taught how society functions, the role of government, and their responsibilities as citizens. Today, our education system focuses heavily on preparing students for career and employment. While that is important, we must ask ourselves, who is teaching our young people how to function responsibly in our society? Madam Speaker, we must also consider the social determinants of health. Nutrition plays a critical role in brain development, concentration, and decision-making. Yet, many young people today are growing up without the balanced nutrition necessary for healthy physical and mental development. If the body is not healthy, the mind struggles to function effectively. And when the mind struggles to function effectively, the ability to absorb knowledge and make responsible decisions becomes compromised. Madam Speaker, the cannabis landscape itself has also evolved. New forms such as vaping products and edible items like gummies have emerged, and these products may appeal easily to younger audiences. Madam Speaker, if we look at the Cannabis Amendment Act of 2022, specifically Section 6, we see that the legislation now allows medicinal recommendations through telemedicine services. As Minister of Health and Wellness, innovations such as telemedicine services can improve the access to health care. However, it is also our responsibility to ensure that these mechanisms operate with appropriate safeguards and responsible oversight. We must also acknowledge another reality. The cannabis available today is often stronger and sometimes mixed with other substances. Individuals may combine marijuana with tobacco or other additives, increasing its potency and the impact on the mind. Madam Speaker, one of the things that I would have noticed and observed in Antigua and Barbuda is smoking and driving. It is something that we must look into and something that we must address.
Honourable Member, you have 1 minute left.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, some of the most brilliant and creative minds in our nation are among our young people. If we lose those minds to addiction or compromised reasoning, the cost to our country is far greater than we often calculate. We cannot afford to lose our future. Reviewing law is not an admission of failure, it is an expression of reasonable governance. My final reason for supporting a joint select committee is that it allows Parliament to formally receive evidence from public health experts, educators, community organizations, and young people themselves, so that any future decision we make are informed by evidence and experience rather than assumption. Good governance does not fear review, good governance welcomes it. If it pleases you, Madam Speaker, I therefore support this resolution.
I recognize the member for St. Mary's South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for acknowledging me. Good morning, members of the House. Madam Speaker, I rise today as the member of St. Mary's South and a member of opposition to support the motion to establish a joint committee to review the cannabis legislation in Antigua and Barbuda using a human rights approach. Madam Speaker, laws must evolve with society. What we are discussing here is not simple cannabis. We are discussing justice, fairness, public health, and the protection of our young people. For decades, many citizens across Antigua and Barbuda have faced criminal penalties for small amounts of cannabis. Penalties that have often had long life consequences affecting employment, travel, and opportunity. A human rights approach demands that we examine whether our laws are proportionate, fair, and effective. However, Madam Speaker, while I support this review, I must highlight a serious loophole that currently exists. When legislation changes or relax without strong safeguards, our youth become vulnerable to abuse of the substance. Across our community, including in St. Mary's South, we are recently seeing trouble signs. Cannabis is sometimes being normalized among teenagers, whether adequate education about the mental health risks, addiction, potential, and impact our brain development. Madam Speaker, this is where the loophole lies. If legislation focuses only on decriminalization, legalization, but fails to put strict protection mechanisms for minors, we risk unintentionally creating a pathway for increased youth access to misuse. The science is clear. The developing brain is, I'm kind of nervous, sensitive to cannabis exposure. Early and frequent use has been linked to reduced academic performance, impairing memory, and increased risk of mental health disorder. Therefore, we are serious about human rights approach. We must remember that young people also have rights, and the rights to protect the right to health and the right to safeguard environment. A joint selective committee is for the right step because it allows Parliament to carefully examine these issues in detail. The committee must look at clear age restrictions and enforcement, public education campaigns and targets at youth, regulation and distribution between marketing, penalties for those who supply cannabis to minors, investment and rehabilitation for a counseling program. Madam Speaker, human rights do not mean absence of regulation. Human rights mean balanced policies that protect individual freedom while safeguarding public welfare. The people of Antigua and Barbuda deserve legislation that is thoughtful, evidence-based, and responsible, and the youth of St. Mary's South, and indeed across our nation, deserve guidance, protection, and opportunity, not exposure to harm through legislation oversight. Therefore, Madam Speaker, I support the establishment of a joint committee because it provides Parliament with the opportunity to close the loopholes, strengthen protection for our youth, and ensure that any reform of cannabis legislation is truly rooted in a human rights framework. Let us not rush to reform without reflection. Let us instead study the evidence, listen to experts from our communities, and craft legislation that protect both justice and our young people. Madam Speaker, for those reasons, I support the motion. Thank you.
I recognize the member for St. John's Rural South.
Madam Speaker, honorable members of this House, knowledge has always been the cornerstone in which men have distinguished themselves throughout generations, and today is no different. Kofi Annan once said, "Knowledge is power, information is liberating, education is the premise of progress in every society, in every family." In order to communicate the relevance of what is taking place, we ought to examine the purpose and importance of establishing the Joint Review Committee in relation to the cannabis legislation. Simply, it is to evaluate both the positive and negative social, legal, economic, and public health impacts from an evidence-based approach. In doing so, we say to the people of Antigua and Barbuda that we are unafraid to analyze the laws we established, not because something is wrong, but because we are human. Therefore, I am in support of the Joint Review Committee. Madam Speaker, the Cannabis Act of 2018, the Misuse of Drugs Act 2022, and all correlating acts are of the same nature, with good intentions, set out to reduce the negative repercussions of the law and to assist adults in practicing responsible activity around the use of cannabis. However, we have unintentionally created more harm than good. As President of the National Youth Parliament firmly stated, in my humblest opinion, it is no different from handing a license to obtain a firearm in every household. A firearm in a household that is unsupervised, unprotected, not monitored. Too often, our government has found itself reacting to crisis than planning with crisis in mind.
signaling a lack of strategic preparation backed by data-driven prevention policies and sound educational frameworks before implementing laws that risk societal upheaval. I would like to remind the honorable members of the National Youth Policy, which was designed with this message at its center. The youth are a valuable resource. They make up the largest part of the productive sector. They have a critical role in nation building, and that all social systems are predicated on the need to impart values, morals, skills, and competencies to the next generation. The lives and experiences of youth growing up today are inextricably bound to economic realities, social processes, technological and media innovations, and cultural flows that traverse national boundaries with increasing momentum. Local concerns indicate that cannabis usage among adolescents remain at an all-time high and is still heavily increasing with the progression of time. The reports on drug use in the Americas 2019 assessment reports that among 12 Caribbean countries that provided data, Antigua and Barbuda ranked the highest with almost 25% prevalence in the use of marijuana among secondary school students. While this data came out 6 years ago, it is still relevant today as it addresses another issue: the lack of current data in order to effectively analyze the usage and effects of cannabis use among youth, leaving policymakers, educators, and the like effectively in the dark in responding to the rising epidemic and other contributing factors plaguing our youth. Without accurate, updated national data, it becomes difficult to determine the true scale of youth exposure or to design effective preventative strategies. Section 60 of the Cannabis Act outlines prohibitions that restrict cannabis use in schools, childcare environments, public spaces, and during the performance of certain duties. However, these prohibitions do not fully address the broader issue of accessibility among youth. For this reason, a comprehensive revision of the existing legislation is both necessary and reasonable. To address youth exposure, education remains the most effective tool for prevention. Equipping young people with accurate knowledge and critical decision-making skills becomes a central responsibility of the education system. Much like the introduction of sex education and the benefits which came from it, cannabis studies would offer the same benefits in assisting young persons with making better informed decisions. Research conducted through the National Library of Medicine suggests that harm reduction education approaches found 92% of educators believed it to be an effective approach to substance use. Similarly, a randomized controlled trial in Australian high schools found that students exposed to harm reduction cannabis education experienced fewer cannabis-related harm and smaller increases in consumption over a 3-year period, suggesting well-designed educational interventions can play a meaningful role in reducing substance-related risks among youths.
Honourable Member, you have 1 minute left.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll use this minute to wrap up. The review allows prevention through preparation, mitigation through control, and protection through knowledge. Thank you.
I recognize the member for St. John's Rural East. Members in the gallery, before you begin, Honourable Member, members in the gallery, please remember to put your phones on silent. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, honourable members, I stand today in this great house representing the Ministry of ICT, Utilities and Energy to speak in proposal of establishing a joint select committee to review cannabis legislation in Antigua and Barbuda with a human rights approach. It is important to address a common misconception. Regulation does not equal endorsement. The reality is that cannabis already exists within our society, culturally, socially, and religiously for decades. Attempting to ignore or suppress this reality does not eliminate it. Instead, what responsible governance demands is that we create structures to regulate, monitor, and manage it responsibly. The Misuse of Drugs Amendment Act of 2018 in Antigua and Barbuda decriminalized possession of up to 15 grams of cannabis and allowed households to cultivate up to 4 plants. However, legislation alone is not the end of reform. the government of Antigua and Barbuda is always seeking ways to improve legislation, and that is why I am proposing the establishment of the Joint Select Committee. Such a committee should assess public health outcomes, economic development, criminal justice impacts, and regulatory effectiveness. Firstly, let us draw our attention to the tracking system outlined in Part 4 of the Cannabis Regulations 2019. The tracking system is how we can monitor all of the activities within the industry. So, for example, when a seed is planted, it gets a permanent name and number which stays with it for its entire life. The track and trace system will be able to tell you if the tree is alive, dead, and harvested, which has been a great digital implementation in this nation since 2022. Now, to build on this point, I will dare to ask the question, with this legislation, can we protect cybersecurity while increasing public transparency? This is exactly why a Joint Select Committee is necessary to provide the public with accurate summarized data while still maintaining patient and doctor confidentiality and business security. So, for example, compliance statistics, total cannabis production in the country, and seed-to-sale tracking data should be made regularly accessible to the public. We must strengthen data collection and transparency, particularly regarding minority and vulnerable populations. This includes examining how policy impacts women, rural communities, and persons with disabilities, ensuring that opportunities within the cannabis sector are equitable and inclusive. Moving forward, in Antigua and Barbuda, the medicinal licensing system of cannabis is in a continuous state of development towards becoming a fully digital authority. Due to this progressive work, the Joint Select Committee is absolutely necessary to aid in the success of this system. Madam Speaker, if the digital licensing process is overly complex, slow, or difficult to navigate, it may unintentionally exclude the very individuals who should benefit from this new industry in the first place. The Joint Select Committee must review the cannabis legislation to ensure that the online portals are well designed for our rural farmers and not so tech-savvy individuals. Additional support mechanisms to consider are digital guidance tools, help desks, or training resources which should accompany the online licensing system to ensure that all consumers are well taken care of. Continually, nowadays, we know that technology rules the world and we are always on our phones, no matter our age and gender. So utilizing online campaigns on social media platforms like TikTok and Facebook to really educate the public on what the cannabis legislation is all about is a must. As a result, via the Joint Select Committee, the citizens of Antigua and Barbuda will become empowered to make informed decisions, which is what we, the government, are strongly advocating for. In conclusion, Madam Speaker, honorable members, all listening persons, you see the material. Establishing a Joint Select Committee to review cannabis legislation in Antigua and Barbuda with a human rights approach is absolutely necessary. Thank you.
I recognize the member for St. Peter.
Honorable Speaker, honorable members of this House, distinguished guests, and my fellow Antiguans and Barbudans watching at home and abroad, good morning. Imagine a single mother in St. John's caring for her elderly parent with chronic pain, who can finally access safe, regulated medicinal cannabis without the shadow of criminalization. Imagine a young woman from a rural community in Barbuda turning her family's traditional knowledge into a licensed cultivation enterprise that creates jobs for her neighbors. Imagine a Rastafarian father exercising his constitutional right to use cannabis as a sacrament openly and proudly in a place of worship his community has fought for decades to protect. These are not distant dreams. These are the very promises of our cannabis reforms, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Acts of 2014, 2018, 2019, and 2024, and the Cannabis Amendment Act of 2022, where we meant to deliver. In many ways, they have decriminalization for small amounts, a regulated medicinal framework through the Antigua and Barbuda Medicinal Cannabis Authority, religious protection that honor our Rastafarian brothers and sisters, and the seeds of an industry that could grow our economy while healing our people. But, honorable members, a promise unexamined is a promise unkept. Over the past decades, we have heard from public, from experts, from women groups, and from youth, from caregivers, and from low-income households. The benefits are real, but they are not reaching everyone equally. Some families have seen new economic doors open, others still knock and find them locked. Some women report that caregiving burdens have grown heavier while access to support remains thin. Youth tell us the message on public health is not always loud enough. Low-income communities ask why the economic opportunities sometimes seem reserved for those who can afford the licensing maze. And across our island, we must ask, are we truly living up to the human rights standards enshrined in our Constitution and the international treaties we proudly uphold? That is why, as Minister of Social and Urban Transformation, I rise today to move this historic motion to establish a joint select committee to conduct a comprehensive, evidence-based, gender-responsive review of our entire cannabis legislative framework with a clear human rights lens at its heart. This is not about tearing down what we have built. It's about pruning the plants so it can grow stronger, fairer, and taller for every Antiguan and Barbudan. The committee mandate is powerful and precise. It will evaluate the scope and operation of the Cannabis Act 2018, Sections 1 to 65, and subsequent amendments for the foundational definitions and establishment of the Antigua and Barbuda Medicinal Cannabis Authority, Sections 1 to 2, 13 to 18. Through the detailed religious use provisions, Section 3 to 12, that protects sacramental cultivations, possessions up to authorized limits, transport to designated places of worship or exempt events, and non-commercial dispensaries. To consult broadly and inclusively with technical expertise in public health, gender affairs, social development, and law. Relevant government ministries, departments and agencies, women's organizations, youth groups, and other community organizations. Religious bodies, including Rastafarian representatives, cultural groups, law enforcement, educators, academic institutions, licensed producers and businesses, and members of the general public, and report back to this Parliament within 1 year with clear evidence-based, actionable recommendations to ensure the entire framework, Sections 1 to 65 of the Cannabis Act 2018 as amended, remains effective, equitable, gender-responsive, people-centered, constitutionally compliant, and forward-looking. Honorable members, this is post-legislative scrutiny at its best, the kind of mature, thoughtful government that small island nations like ours do exceptionally well when choose to. It is evidence-based, it is inclusive, it is transformative. And today, in this special sitting led by young women leaders, we are sending a powerful message. The future of policy in Antigua and Barbuda will be shaped by those who understand that truly development leaves no one behind. Fellow citizens, our cannabis laws are not just about a plant. They are about dignity. They are about economic justice. They are about healing bodies, minds, and communities. They are about writing the next chapter of our nation's story. One where community grows like the very herb we regulate, strong, sustainable, and shared by all. I therefore urge every member of this honorable House to support the establishment of this Joint Select Committee. Let us show the world that Antigua and Barbuda does not just pass laws, we perfect them. We do not just promise equity, we deliver it. Together, let us cultivate a framework that is effective, equitable, gender-responsive, people-centered, and truly evidence-based. I move the motion. Thank you. God bless Antigua.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the member for St. Philip's North asked us, what are we afraid of? My answer is nothing. My question is, what are you hiding? Madam Speaker, earlier I referenced a committee that was mandated by the Cabinet of Antigua and Barbuda to do a review, and I wish to table it, Madam Speaker, if I may, to review the decriminalization of marijuana in Antigua and Barbuda. Madam Speaker, this report highlighted everything that they're proposing today, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, if we were serious about results, we wouldn't be voting for a committee. We would be voting for the immediate actions already identified in this report. If you want a copy, I can have one for you.
Did you read the report?
Honorable members.
Madam Speaker, in that very report, we recommended that a national training mandate be established. Madam Speaker, the right to education is hollow if our schools are not safe, informed environments. The 2025 report found that 93% of educators are not equipped to manage students in the schools who are using cannabis. Only 21% are equipped. By failing to provide this training, we are neglecting the welfare of our students. Furthermore, Madam Speaker, we even recommended a medical certification, the right to health, which was identified by our minister there. It is not a theory, Madam Speaker. It is the right of a citizen to walk into their local clinic and receive informed care. Madam Speaker, instead of forming a committee, the government should simply implement a dedicated implementation unit within the existing departments that we already have. We already pay for them. All they need to do, use the 2025 report and cross-reference it with the 2024 Act and bring us a regulation package by the next sitting. Why the wait? At a time of extreme economic pressure, taxpayers should not be funding a performative consultation. Every dollar squandered on this committee's intersectional study is a dollar stolen from a young entrepreneur's grant or a drug rehabilitation clinic. Madam Speaker, I oppose still.
I recognize the member for St. John City West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Member of the opposition, I have a question for you. Do all of your fellow honorable members agree with your opposition? It seems not. Because if I recall, Akila Grant said that she was in full support of the motion for the exact reason we are in full support of the motion. To ensure the safeguard of our citizens, to safeguard our citizens. Member of the opposition, I hear you speak of Farmer George and I hear you speak of Mary. Can I ask you, why are you opposing this very peer review committee to support Farmer George and to support Mary? Exactly. Does Farmer Mary and Farmer George understand their rights? Are they educated on the law? As you have rightly pointed out, there are implementation gaps in the law. We are not hiding that. However, it would be irresponsible for us to not consult with the public before we implement anything. Are we just shooting in the dark here? This committee is for the benefit of Farmer George and Mary. We want to hear their voices. This committee is for the benefit of our youth to further develop both Antigua and Barbuda. And I address the Minister of Barbuda. This review motion is needed to prevent any mistakes in implementing any laws that may affect Barbuda. Forgive me, Madam Speaker. We want to bridge legislation, society, and the economy in a way that matters. You say that this is legislation procrastination. If the legislation is functioning perfectly, why oppose an evidence-based review? This is precisely, all the reasons you have mentioned is precisely why a committee is needed. You claim it must touch the people, but how can it touch the people if they have no knowledge of their rights? How can you provide medicinal cannabis if you are unsure of the effects of our people? The review of the motion and implementation is support the entrepreneurs, the farmers, the civilians. I beg your forgiveness, Madam Speaker, I'm very nervous. In conclusion, I would just like to say that this review committee is to safeguard our public. This review committee is to ensure that we hear the voices of our people and understand their needs on a deeper level. I thank you.
I recognize the honorable member for All Saints West.
Madam Speaker, I believe the proposition is missing the central points of the debate. Again, our Honorable Prime Minister keeps stating that it is a peer review committee. I would like to know if everyone on the proposition side is on the same page. Is it a peer review committee or a joint select committee? Now, right. Now, the opposition, with the exception of one person, has never argued that review is wrong. Review is a normal part of good governance. Now, our argument is much simpler. A joint select committee is not necessary at this moment, at this time. Antigua and Barbuda only legalized medical cannabis and hemp cultivation in 2020 under the Cannabis Act. The Antigua and Barbuda Cannabis Authority was established to regulate the industry, oversee licensing, and ensure compliance with the law. In other words, regulatory systems already exist once again, yet the proposition is speaking as though there is a complete absence of oversight. Madam Speaker, there is not. Now, the proposition has raised concerns about what could go wrong in the sector, but possible concerns are not the same as proven systematic failure. Before establishing a parliamentary committee, this House should at least be presented with clear evidence that the current framework is not functioning. So far, no data has been presented showing regulatory collapse, widespread corruption, or a breakdown in the licensing system. And if the legislation is still new, as the proposition themselves have acknowledged, then the logical step is to allow the framework time to operate before declaring it insufficient. Now, oversight is already built into the system. Ministers can be questioned in this House.
Honorable member for All Saints West, we're going to have to stop you because we have to put this to a vote.
No problem.
Madam Clerk.
Closure and adjournment.
I now declare this Parliament sitting adjourned, sine die.
We haven't put this to a vote. Honorable members, Sergeant at Arms, you can put back the mace. We are now putting the matter to a vote. So we will now put this to a vote. Those in favor of the resolution say aye.
Aye.
Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. So now that we are coming to a close, I would like to thank each and every one for coming out to witness the second cohort of Y-Willers here to put this motion, whether they're in favor or do they oppose. We would like to thank the organizers of the event, and to our Y-Willers, both proposing and opposing, thank you so much. To our Sergeant-at-Arms, thank you so much. Well-wishers, parents, students, whoever you are in the gallery, we want to say thank you very much. And for those of you who are listening and viewing, thank you as well. And we are now going to adjourn. Madam Clerk.
I now declare this parliamentary sitting adjourned, sine die.
I second the motion.
We have now adjourned this parliament sitting, sine die.